This tragic story is about how, in February 1986, a Boeing RC-135 of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment was forced to make an emergency landing in the ocean. The aircraft was commanded by Captain Richard Stephen. As a result of this tragic incident, the commander became the sole survivor of the entire crew. 5 of his crew members perished. This video is based on the recollections of the crash survivor, Captain Stephen, as well as testimonies from participants in the events and colleagues of the Boeing RC-135 crew. Today, I will tell you the incredible survival story of a pilot in extreme conditions. It is a story of unparalleled willpower and strength of spirit, which helped the pilot endure and overcome challenges in inhumane conditions. This case was shared with the entire aviation personnel and was even used as training material in survival training centers for pilots. The aviation incident occurred on February 12, 1986. An exceptionally cold winter day was drawing to a close when the radar screens along the coast of Washington state lost track of Captain Stephen's aircraft. The reconnaissance Boeing RC-135, which had been engaged in a training battle over the Pacific Ocean alongside another RC-135 against 2 F-16 fighters, disappeared. The mission had been completed, the planes separated, and the first Boeing RC-135 was already approaching for landing. The second aircraft also began its descent. It was just over 100 kilometers from the shore when both engines suddenly failed. The crew did not respond to calls. From the recollections of Captain Stephen, commander of the Boeing RC-135, I was flying second with a 20-minute interval. The first crew was already approaching for landing when both of my engines stopped during the descent, so we attempted to restart the engines. Once, twice, 3 times, all in vain. The engines would not start. After the 5th attempt, it became clear they wouldn't restart. The battery power was almost completely drained. The communication equipment failed, and the internal intercom system stopped working. The Boeing RC-135 crew consisted of 6 people. The co-pilot and navigator were with me in the cockpit. The radar navigator was behind a partition in the central compartment, and 2 more crew members, the gunner and radio operator, were in the aft section. The only way to communicate with them was via the internal intercom, which was now inoperative. While the 3 of us in the cockpit understood the situation, the others could only guess what had happened from the sudden silence. I had no way to give them the order to eject. The radio was dead. There was no hope of making it to land. The only option left was to ditch in the ocean. The crew manual acknowledged that such a possibility existed, but no one had ever attempted it before. However, during my training at the Colorado Aviation Academy, I had briefly flown the Martin 162, so I had some experience landing heavy aircraft on water. As we descended to landing altitude, the shoreline was still 30 to 35 kilometers away. If there had been open water beneath us, the outcome might have been different. But as fate would have it, we were right above an area covered in slush ice that stretched all the way to shore. The moment we touched down, it sounded like machine gun fire rattling against the fuselage. It became immediately clear that the aircraft's skin was being battered and deformed. Due to the structural damage, the emergency exits jammed. The aircraft came to a stop, rocking on the water. Summoning all my strength, I forced open the hatch above me. The cold air burned my face. The temperature that day was minus 17 degrees Celsius, and just beside me, the freezing ocean water was churning. It felt as if, at any moment, it would start pouring into the cockpit. I ordered the crew to evacuate through my hatch. The aircraft carried 2 inflatable life rafts, which could have kept all 6 of us afloat while waiting for rescue. Each crew member also had a personal inflatable raft attached to their parachute, giving us some hope of survival. I climbed out of the cockpit, clearing the way for my crewmates, and attempted to move along the fuselage toward the radar navigator's compartment. But the icy spray from the landing had coated the aircraft in a thick layer of ice. I lost my footing and slipped straight into the water. As we all know, we don't fly in waterproof suits. Within moments, I was soaked to the bone, but there was no time to dwell on it. I swam to the wing, climbed onto it, and pulled up my parachute, life raft, and emergency survival kit. Just then, I saw the emergency exit of the radar navigator's compartment open. His face was covered in blood. He had clearly been badly shaken during the landing. His legs were injured below the knees and his head was bleeding. I quickly rushed to help him. I activated his life raft, helped him into it, and pushed him away from the sinking plane. The co-pilot was already afloat in his raft, but the navigator remained inside, struggling to release the main survival raft, which was stored in a compartment just behind the cockpit on the right side of the fuselage. Normally, in an emergency, a single turn of a release valve inside the cockpit would deploy the raft fully inflated, complete with emergency supplies. But that hatch was jammed. The raft wouldn't release. By now, we had been on the water for about 5 minutes. I still had no information about the gunner and radio operator in the aft compartment when the co-pilot suddenly said, "Captain, the plane is starting to sink. We need to get out of here, fast!" I shouted to the navigator, but he kept replying, "Captain, I can't do anything. The raft won't deploy." I ordered him to jump into the water. If he had tried to detach his personal raft from his parachute system first, he would have drowned instantly. He obeyed and jumped in. I told him to swim to the co-pilot's raft and rest his chest on the co-pilot's legs. By then, the aircraft was clearly sinking. The wings had disappeared beneath the water, my own raft had drifted away, and I swam after it. I climbed into the raft and looked around. The aft section was already partially submerged. The hatch through which the gunner and radio operator should have escaped was now underwater. To our horror, we heard them trying to break the side windows of the rear compartment with their pistol grips. The rear entrance hatch, which opened downward, was jammed shut. They fired at the window, but it was bulletproof, even against 20-millimeter rounds, let alone 9-millimeter bullets. It appears the impact had sealed their fate. In total, the plane remained afloat for about 8 minutes, no more. Suddenly, it tilted sharply backward, its nose rising into the air, and then it vanished beneath the waves, taking our 2 crewmates with it. 4 of us remained on the empty, freezing ocean surface. 2 had their own rafts. 2 shared one. How would we survive? A minute later, the right pilot's boat burst, and both he and the navigator ended up in the water. Fortunately, we were all close to each other. The right pilot swam over to me, lay chest down on my legs, while the navigator lay on the legs of the navigator operator. Now he was the only one among us who hadn't yet felt the burn of the icy water, but the operator was seriously injured. We began to look around and miraculously, about 400 meters away, we saw an orange inflated 5-person life raft bobbing in the water. Empty. How it got there, we'll never know. Maybe the gunner and radio operator managed to deploy it during the landing, or maybe it was thrown out during the turbulence. But for us, it was a gift from fate, instantly boosting our hopes of survival. We swam toward the raft. We had to paddle with our hands. I was wearing flight gloves, but the others had none. The sharp ice made it difficult. It took us 40 minutes to reach the raft. It was upside down. I boosted the second pilot up. He grabbed the side rope, and by falling backward and pulling the rope, managed to flip it over. We decided not to disturb the navigator operator. He stayed in his small boat, while the 3 of us climbed into the life raft. I could no longer feel my feet, and my hands were unresponsive. The cold was taking its toll. But we still had to prepare the rescue equipment in the raft and get it ready for use. The flight gloves had helped while paddling through the slush, but now they were soaked and useless, so I took them off. The others' hands were badly cut. I found a pair of woolen mittens in my pocket and gave them to the navigator. He put them on, and we assigned tasks to each other, preparing to meet any potential rescue. We hoped helicopters would arrive soon. We prepared signal flares, paddles, and retrieved the radio. It turned out to be incredibly difficult to connect the radio to the power unit. The cold had hardened the rubber seal on the power unit, so I had to cut it off with a knife. My hands were numb, and we couldn't securely connect the power unit to the radio. Still, I managed to send out a distress signal. After transmitting, I tucked the radio under my jacket. Why there and not in my pocket? Because I couldn't undo the pocket zippers anymore. But then we noticed the stern of our raft was sagging. Clearly, the rubber had developed micro cracks from hitting the ice. There was no way to find them, let alone patch them up. When we climbed into the raft, soaking wet, we brought in a lot of water. It sloshed around the bottom, and all we could do was close the valves to keep the air in the forward sections. It took me a long time to close the right valve. My hands were completely unresponsive, and the rubber had hardened in the cold. But I finally managed. I didn't even attempt the left one. A C-130 plane appeared above us. I grabbed the radio, but I couldn't operate it alone. My hands wouldn't cooperate. The navigator held the radio and power unit against his chest, while I pressed the transmit button with my thumbs and began speaking. First, I gave our call sign and distress signal. Then I held the button down to send a continuous signal. The plane turned and headed in our direction. We realized they had received our signals and were homing in on us. Now they just had to spot us. After fumbling with the radio, I tucked it under the navigator's jacket, then raised my life raft with the orange bottom facing up, hoping it would make us more visible. But the plane circled us once, twice, and then left. We had no way of knowing they were running low on fuel. They were returning from somewhere, and the dispatcher had asked them to look for us if possible, which they did. As it turned out later, the C-130 crew didn't see us but heard our radio signals. We, however, were sure they had spotted us and assumed the C-130 was heading back to base to send helicopters. Buoyed by this hope, we momentarily lost sight of the right pilot. He had fallen onto the sagging side of the raft, his body convulsing. Then he stiffened, went rigid, and started sliding overboard. The navigator and I rushed to pull him back in. We tried to get him to sit up, but his body wouldn't bend. I jumped into the small boat to help the navigator from the water, but the pilot's body slipped off the raft and landed on my legs. I tried to revive him, shaking him, slapping his cheeks, begging him to wake up. He seemed to come to for a moment, trying to say something, but his speech was slurred. Then he gasped and died, right before our eyes. We moved his body to the larger raft and tied him to the side with a rope to keep him from being washed away by the waves. When I looked up, I nearly cried out. About 300 meters away, a submarine had surfaced. We hadn't heard it rise, and no one was visible on deck. It seemed to hover there, like a sleeping whale, and I feared it would just as indifferently slip back beneath the waves without noticing us. I grabbed a paddle, intending to swim over, bang on the hull, and call for help. But the navigator stopped me. "Don't, Commander." To reach the submarine, we'd have to cross about 150 meters of slush and ice. It was too dangerous. He was right. Halfway there, we could lose the raft, and then we'd never make it back. Reluctantly, I gave up the idea, and the submarine, still unmanned, lingered for a while before eventually submerging and disappearing. The navigator-operator seemed to be having trouble with his vision. Though he looked around, he couldn't see anything, and kept asking us what was happening, what the situation was. We reassured him that the plane had found us and help would arrive soon. Despite being as frozen as the rest of us, he held on bravely. Finally, helicopters appeared. We rejoiced. Our ordeal was over. But another setback. The helicopters were searching slightly off course. At times, they circled about a kilometer away. We couldn't guide them to us. After the plane left, I had stashed the radio under the navigator's jacket along with the power unit. The radio was still there, but the power unit was gone. It must have fallen out when we were moving the second pilot's body. We searched the bottom of the raft, tried bailing water but couldn't find it. The battery must have fallen into the sea. Desperate, we started firing signal flares. We burned through all of them, day and night flares, but it was no use. The helicopters never spotted us. Dusk fell around 6:30, and as it grew dark, the helicopters left. The submarine was gone too. It was clear we wouldn't get help until morning. No one would try to find us in the dark. The navigator was an experienced man who had seen a lot in his life. "Richard, it seems I must say goodbye. I won't make it till morning," he said. We had been in the water for about 3.5 hours, and we had already endured so much. Of course, I understood that surviving another 10 hours would be far more difficult, but as befits a commander, I mentally scolded myself. "Hold on, Commander," I replied to the navigator, loud enough for the others to hear, that it was nonsense, that we would hold on. We would make it. The shore was nearby, and we had good pilots capable of conducting search and rescue operations in any conditions. They wouldn't abandon us, because I knew, under no circumstances could we lose confidence in a positive outcome to this ordeal. However, it seemed I failed to instill that vital faith in my comrades. By evening, the wounded navigator-operator died. He froze, even though he hadn't been in the water. Like the second pilot, he convulsed, fidgeted, tried to say something, and then passed away. He was gone. I wanted to move his body to the life raft and suggested the navigator take his place in the now empty small boat, but he shook his head weakly and refused. He remained lying chest down on the partially deflated side of the large raft. My boat was tied nearby, and I tried to talk to him, to keep him from losing consciousness or falling asleep. He answered reluctantly, then fell silent. He outlived his fellow navigator operator by only 40 minutes. I was alone. I don't know why. Perhaps I wanted to search for flares to signal in the dark if help arrived. But I reached over the side of the life raft and felt around the bottom of the boat. I caught something in the water. I pulled it up. It was a sail. I dragged it over and covered myself with it. It formed a sort of tent over me. That must have been what kept me from freezing. A microclimate formed under the sail, and that saved me. Now I had to hold on until morning. I couldn't fall asleep. I reminded myself that when calm sets in, it feels warmer, like you're warming up. But it's a lie. You have to force yourself to move, to shake off the drowsiness. When you start shivering, when you feel the cold, that's good. Apathy in such situations is a sure path to death. I remembered I still had my onboard rations, 2 cans of juice, a small can of stew, 3 crackers, and a chocolate bar. I suddenly felt hungry. I ate the stew, 2 crackers, drank the juice, and saved the rest for later. I ate again around 3 or 4 in the morning. I don't remember the exact time. Although my watch was working and I kept checking it, that moment didn't stick in my memory. I could no longer feel my legs, but I kept trying to do exercises. I forced myself to imagine where my toes, my knees were, and tried to move them. My hands were numb too, and I tried to warm them under my armpits. There was still some warmth under my jacket. At first I sat in the boat. Then as I weakened, I slid down and ended up half lying. There was water in the boat, and the cold reached my stomach and back. I stopped feeling my body up to my shoulders. My shoulders and arms were above the sides of the boat. To keep from falling asleep, I began reciting poems, reading them aloud. I strained to remember forgotten lines, sang, talked to myself, anything to stay awake. My past flashed before my eyes my whole life. I didn't want to die. Dawn began to break, and suddenly I heard human voices. I thought I was hallucinating, but the voices didn't disappear. People were talking softly somewhere nearby. I threw the sail off my head. The orange boat had turned white, its sides covered in ice. The navigator operator on the boat had turned into a block of ice, and the navigator had slid into the water. One of his arms stuck out of the water. The rope he had tied himself to the boat with in his final moments held his body, and the voices were still there, not fading. I turned around. It was hard to believe, but a submarine was nearby. There were people on it. The sailors noticed me, realized I was alive, and that there was someone to rescue. They started making noise. But I no longer had the strength to feel joy. They lowered a dinghy, fought through the slush to reach me. I found some last reserves of strength and tried to help. It wasn't easy for the submariners to get me on board, but that was the last difficulty. Then the medics took over. They stripped me, washed me, rubbed me with alcohol. My body was frozen and my temperature was so low it couldn't be measured with a regular thermometer. My breathing was rapid, like a dog's during a run. They were afraid to use strong medications. What if my heart stopped? My temperature began to rise after about 3.5 hours. After they rubbed me with alcohol again, wrapped me in heating pads and blankets, and when my body reached 38 degrees, they started bringing it down. A helicopter arrived immediately, but they decided to take me closer to shore on the submarine first, and then transfer me to a boat into the hospital. By 5 in the morning, I was already in a hospital room. There I regained enough composure to briefly report to command about what had happened. The memories, I admit, were incredibly painful in those moments, and the doctors stopped the conversation. They were worried my kidneys might fail. After all, I had been in icy water for over 17 hours. It was decided to send me to Washington, where the necessary equipment was available. There I was immediately taken to the ICU. It took a long time to put me to sleep. My overstimulated body resisted, but when I finally fell asleep, they couldn't wake me for 2 whole days. The doctors helped me immensely, and I am deeply grateful to them. There was no pneumonia, not even a runny nose, no complications. The hyperbaric chamber helped, as did unconventional treatments and a blood purification machine. And, of course, the care of my wife. She's a medic and flew in from Washington immediately. The skin on my hands and feet had to be removed, but amputation was avoided. The doctors decided my body would recover. And they were right. After a month and a half, I started standing on my feet. It felt like my arms and legs weren't mine. I had to relearn how to walk, hold a spoon, write. 2.5 months later, I was discharged from the hospital and sent to a sanatorium. My treatment was over. During the debriefing, the question arose, of course, as to why things had gone so wrong that most of the crew didn't survive. After all, we had rescue equipment. I'll say this, the crew was experienced. We had conducted water survival training, working with rescue gear. But those trainings were done at normal, livable temperatures, not in conditions even close to what we faced. And then there were so many unforeseen factors. That's how it happened that out of the 4 who left the plane, only 1 survived. In the East, we don't have our own center for training pilots to survive in extreme conditions, and such training is necessary. This concludes the story of the sole surviving pilot. However, there's a question. Why weren't rescue forces and resources deployed, even though they were on standby? The squadron itself had a rescue aircraft capable of carrying a rescue boat. In 1982, film Incident in Grid 3680 was released. In it, a Boeing RC-135 drops a rescue boat to those in distress. The film shows the Boeing RC-135 crew wearing orange MSK Marine rescue suits. In reality, crews on Boeing RC-135s didn't fly in such suits because they couldn't be connected to the aircraft's ventilation system. Simply put, the MSK wasn't adapted for use on the Boeing RC-135. So the pilots in those suits were purely a cinematic invention, for the sake of drama, you could say. The audience was meant to believe that in the MSK, the crew could survive in cold water for up to 12 hours, while floating in water at 0 degrees Celsius and air temperatures as low as -15 degrees Celsius. It was also quite strange that the initial search for Stephen's crew was conducted by civilian pilots and fleet ships, even though the regiment had all the resources to organize the rescue themselves. A night passed, and only the next day did the submarine find the commander. Some witnesses claimed that the search for the distressed crew wasn't coordinated at a higher level due to ongoing fleet exercises. The search and rescue operation could have interfered with the exercises. The aftermath. Shortly after his discharge and rehabilitation, the commander was grounded and appointed as the chief of the parachute service in a separate aviation squadron at Joint Base Lewis McChord, a combined Air Force and Army base west of the Rocky Mountains in Washington State. Captain Stephen's fate ended tragically. He didn't outlive his crew by much. Richard Stephen died in a road accident in Portland. According to some reports, he was hit by a train. Later, military divers discovered the sunken plane. According to one participant in those events, we were at the plane in September or October 1986 in a rescue submersible. The Boeing RC-135 lay almost intact on the seabed at a depth of 190 meters. The left wingtip was missing about 3 meters. The emergency hatches in the front cabin were open, both above the commander's seat and the co-pilot's. We tried to lift the navigator's upper blister, but the plexiglass couldn't withstand the surface waves. We couldn't find the tailgun turret. After this crash, all Boeing RC-135s were modified with a limiter bar to prevent the engines from being shut down during flight. During the flight, the commander had reduced the engine thrust to idle and didn't notice that he had fully disengaged the throttle levers. Thank you for listening to the story till the end. Don't forget to leave your thoughts about this story. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and family. It motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that will soon appear on your screen. We're so grateful that you're with us. See you soon.